I want to talk about the opportunities in the infrastructure and operations side of cloud engineering in this whole AI space and world that we live in, right? I think everyone hyper focuses on how cool it is to be able to work with an AI model through an API. And that stuff is cool, but it doesn't really interest me that much. I have an infrastructure and operations background. I'm fascinated by the fact that, we can have this rinky dink laptop that manages so much infrastructure, so much scale. That's the stuff that interests me. And I think there's a lot of potential and opportunity here. So if you are new to space and you kind of want to understand a little bit more about the innovations going on there, I'm here to kind of talk a little bit more about them. And I will be only talking about Azure. Of course, I work at Microsoft. I have more of an idea what's going on in that space. I'm sure GCP and AWS are also doing a lot of innovation in that space. I'm just not really the one to talk about that. And with all that being said, hi, I'm GPS. I do cloud things at Microsoft and I teach here on YouTube all for free. So please do me a favor, like, comment, and subscribe. It really, 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 really does help. And welcome to a new video. All right, so if we break down a data center, what do you have? You have storage, you have compute, and you have networking. You have a couple of other things, but we can primarily focus on those core components. And let's also talk about AI models, because the goal of all the infrastructure innovation is to better be able to handle and work and create these models. And these models are massive. Like, they're getting bigger and bigger, and there seems to be no end in sight if you look at the trends, which also means that the supercomputers that are being created to handle these are also getting bigger and more powerful, right? I think the H100, the Azure submitted it back in November of 2023, just a fraction of what it's capable of to be ranked. And it was ranked #1 out of public cloud supercomputers. And they're already working to design, or might already be more than designed, the next one. So like supercomputers are continuing to come out, and these are massive machines. You got to think of like the memory footprint that a model requires to be trained on a supercomputer. Like, you need so much for like the parameters, for the KV cache, for everything that a model requires, right? And alongside the supercomputers, you also need things like power, and you need cooling, you need networking and storage, right? So if we've kind of focused just on like cooling, right? We're at a point where cooling with like traditional fans just does not work. It consumes too much power, and it also consumes things like water. So we're now seeing innovation at the infrastructure level of new chips, or I think some companies are calling them custom accelerators. I know Azure is calling the Maya chip a custom accelerator. It's essentially like a really specific GPU for AI workloads. Like, you can't plug that GPU into like a custom PC. And the cool thing about these chips, this Maya specifically, is that it is meant to be liquid cooled natively. And if you know anything about data centers, they're not really liquid cooled native, right? So what they did with this Maya thing is they created this thing called I think a sidekick. So it's like this kind of like a rack, right? Where you can plug that into an existing data center, and you will have a liquid cooled like rack, right? That, I think, is the first step towards innovating on the data center, like the physical front. I think we're going to start to see companies create data centers that are liquid cooled natively, right? Because these custom racks take up space where you could probably be loading up other infrastructure that's required. So then if you have any interest in, I don't know, maybe you have a background in heating, ventilation, air conditioning, or cooling, HVAC, which my dad happens to have a background in, so I'm very aware of that space. But you want to kind of jump into cloud engineering, maybe look into the innovations happening in the data centers, and you could potentially leverage your skill sets there for that. I think that would be awesome. I always say that if I had to start in a brand new career now, I would go into something HVAC related, because I think that career, especially with data centers, has endless potential. And I've heard that even at an apprentice level, they make pretty decent money. So that's what I would do. So just an idea of like the innovation happening in the cooling front. In the power front, they're also trying to leverage low-level programming to kind of oversubscribe the power that are going to the servers, right? Because like if a server is at 100% power, it doesn't necessarily mean that the workloads are taking advantage of that. because you also have different types of workloads for your models. Like it's not always doing the same exact thing. And some of the workloads may require more, some may require less. So what they want to do is they want to essentially like you have a cluster of servers, right? And let's say it's using 100% power, right? But or it has 100% power available, but the workload is only consuming, I don't know, 30, 40, 50%, something like that. How can they move another server into that cluster to continue using that power? And they have this thing called Project Polka, which is essentially doing that. And it's able to cap, it's able to throttle, it's able to kind of like make these moves and oversubscribe the power with minimal performance loss, which I think is interesting. So if you have any interest in like, I don't know, like an electrical background and some low level programming, there's potential there as well. Again, I think this stuff is fascinating. It's all about getting the most out of a piece of infrastructure, which I think is just the coolest stuff ever. Additionally, opportunities in the networking space. I know there are all new sorts of cabling coming out. Like Azure has the most amount of InfiniBand deployed at the data centers, and those improve latency. Obviously, across clusters, you need networking because sometimes you may have a job working on one cluster and another part of that job is working on another cluster. So networking is very important there too. So things like there's innovation happening in cabling, there's innovation happening in actually building out these data centers, which I think is fascinating as well. In the storage space, I know they're working on implementing better caching. So if you have any interest in kind of leveraging, once again, lower level programming and you have a great understanding of storage, there's potential there as well in terms of implementing and just better improving caching with storage infrastructure. They also have this thing, the last thing I want to mention, they have this thing called Project Forge, which is pretty much like a AI workload resource manager, which out of all these things, this is a thing that I think is so interesting. And like the thing that I would love to work with, I'm actively looking into like, how can I become involved with this stuff? But you can think of it as like, okay, you have all your GPUs in a region, part of a pool, right? Because kind of how it works now is you have a team and they get their GPU, and if they're not leveraging all of it, then it kind of just sits idle. So what Project Forge does is it grabs all the GPUs in a region and puts them in a pool. And then the team is assigned a tier. So maybe like premium tier or lower, whatever. I don't remember exactly the names. And they launch a task, right? Let's say a lower level tier task is running on a GPU, and then a higher tier comes. Well, then that lower one gets removed from the GPU. The higher tier will start to run. But Project Forge is smart enough to be like, okay, let's find another space for this lower tier task to continue running, and it'll go and do that. Significant amount of programming in this, but I think the stuff is fascinating, right? Additionally, they have like a reliability scheduler, and if it is able to see, kind of like your task manager, it's able to see if something has failed, to restart it. It can log tickets, things like that. I think it's just so interesting. Essentially, like a task manager for all things AI workload, and I think that stuff is so cool. So anyway, I just want to kind of share like innovations in that space that are happening, and this is stuff that I pay attention to all the time. If I start to see roles that kind of reflect these skills, I will share them. But I just think it is such a great time to be working in the operations and infrastructure space. And hopefully you find it interesting as well. Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you in the next video.